Welcome to the Herland Report. Chris Farrell, you are with the Judicial Watch. You've been on the board of directors for the Judicial Watch for many, many years. You are a distinguished military graduate from Fordham University and also a military intelligence officer specializing in counterintelligence and human intelligence. And we're discussing the great work of Judicial Watch. We would argue the most important public watchdog here in the United States at the moment, investigating government corruption and the misuse of power among the elites. And one of the most particularly interesting elements in President Trump's address to the nation during the stand-up with Congress, I found, was his blatant attack on the drug industry, the billion-dollar drug industry that sifts into America from its southern border.
Yep. So America right now is facing an incredible crisis over heroin and opioid addiction, but in particular, the deadliest part of that is fentanyl, which is, a derivative narcotic which is killing people at a rate that no one has any even real sense of. And so I'll give you an example that I think clarifies this in a good way. So the low number, and this is low, is that there's 75,000 deaths a year in the United States associated with heroin/fentanyl overdoses. So what does that mean? Well, take a Boeing 737 with mostly 25 and under, there's some older, but generally speaking 25 and under. Take a Boeing 737 and crash it every day. If we crashed a plane every single day, killed everyone on board, what do you think our FAA, our Transportation Administration, the airlines, would everyone just sort of shrug and say, oh, well, it's just another airplane crash? No, there would be hysterical. There would be a commensurate response to the deadly threat that was posed by whatever the defect was that had these planes crashing. But you'd have to crash a plane every day to equal the number of heroin overdose. That's the gravity. Our entire experience in Vietnam was about 58,000 killed. We're doing another 20, 30,000 more, not for a period of an entire war. This is every year. And so to turn a blind eye to that, to say that there's no crisis, is very misleading. 90% of the heroin in the country comes across our Mexican border, chiefly from the Sinaloa cartel. And then the other sort of wild card to that is that the communist Chinese are mailing in. They're using US mail, they're using other delivery systems, whether it's all the other commercial providers. They're sending what they call research chemicals. That's how they're labeled, that's how they get through customs. They're sending research chemicals into the United States that really are the foundation, the chemical foundation for fentanyl production. And this is a very grave matter. That's just one segment of the drug crisis we face in this country, but it's probably the greatest, most deadly immediate threat.
I do believe 27 million Americans are on illicit drugs, and the Mayo Clinic cites as high as 7 out of 10 Americans are on prescription drugs. It really is an epidemic.
Yeah, it's, I mean, all that heroin gets into the United States, and this is a terribly unpopular thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. If you think all that huge amount of drugs is getting to the United States simply by very crafty smugglers, then you're deluding yourself. An enormous part of the problem, again, terribly unpopular, but I'll say it, has to do with law enforcement corruption. I'll give you a brief example. People think of Florida and they think of citrus, orange and grapefruit, and the huge crop there. If you think of South Texas, the equivalent in the agribusiness world are pecans. And it's an enormous business. Science has yet to develop a machine that can shell a pecan. It's all handwork. And so there's groves and groves and orchards full of pecan trees in South Texas right along the border. The trees are literally shaken by a machine. All the nuts are harvested up and put in 2,000-pound bags. They go across the border into Mexico for all the handwork to actually shell the nuts. They're scooped back up into 2,000-pound bags, and they're shipped back across into the United States. And these trucks go back and forth across the border every day from about November to about April. Thousands of them. What do you think you can move in those 2,000-pound bags of pecan nuts? Anything you want. Drugs, money, people, weapons, any sort of contraband. That's one way in which front companies, and this is, in this case, agribusiness companies, will exploit the regular, normal trade, what would otherwise be a legitimate business, but it's one way in which these sorts of things are conducted. There's people that turn a blind eye to that sort of activity in sort of a passive minor role, and I'm speaking of law enforcement people. Why don't you go get a cup of coffee? Go come back in 10 minutes, that kind of a thing. And there's others that are involved in facilitating the movement of these sorts of shipments. An enormous amount of drugs are actually captured or caught at the port of entry, but the places in between, there's all kinds of stuff that moves. And there's a difference between what type of drug you're trying to move. So heroin, small, something the size of this pillow, can be put almost anywhere. But marijuana is a bulk crop, right? And so you need backpackers to carry these 75-pound bales of marijuana across the border. And so even how the drugs are moved, how the contraband is moved, depends upon where you are, what the illicit drug is, and the geography of where you're trying to move it to. It's a very sophisticated business. It's at least $20 billion, at least, probably more. There's a lot of money to be made. The cartels know how to do it. And unfortunately, there are people within U.S. law enforcement at all levels, so from local all the way to federal. And I'm not just saying this in a cavalier fashion. I won't on camera, but I can assure you, I've communicated with the Department of Justice, with Senator Grassley when he was the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, and others. Names, dates, times, places, people. We have a 7-year-long investigation in El Paso, Texas, that points out all sorts of public corruption there. It's a very grave problem. There really needs to be a thorough house cleaning.
It's interesting looking back at the American mob from Chicago, 1930,
Sure.
40 and 50, and then into the 50s to see how the mobster money was laundered through putting stocks and buying up European companies and entering into the Hollywood and the entertainment industry, the gambling and all of that. And that money really went international, to put it that way, building up parts of South America as well. And I do believe in the 50s there was a clear thought that drugs were not to be sold to the children in the street. But something much more sinister has taken over today. You Americans are selling drug to your own children.
Yeah, it's, and what as far as the financial model of what, sort of 1930s Chicago gangsters were doing and what is happening today, look, you have dirty money and you need to make it legit. And so in order to do that, I can think of an agribusiness operating outside of El Paso, Texas, that I think of as sort of it's the Sinaloa cartel's embassy in the United States. That's how I view them. And they're very sophisticated. They have real estate holdings all across the southeastern or southwestern United States. They have hotels, they have businesses. They make an enormous amount of money, and it becomes a challenge at some point to launder that money, because it needs to show up someplace on somebody's books, because they want to put it to use, right? They want to make more money with their money. And so the financial crimes aspect is really a second whole layer to what the drug trafficking. The sort of unintended consequence of successful drug trafficking is the financial crimes aspect of it. That's the follow-on.
And that makes you wonder where the mainstream media stands.
They're asleep at the switch. I mean, they have next to no interest in pursuing these stories. Frankly, because number one, it's a lot of work. They're lazy. Number two, you can be at risk personally in doing this because the people that you would expose, they don't have a very great sense of humor about this. And then thirdly, there's liability and exposure legally, right? They name the wrong person or the wrong entity. They don't have sufficient proof, but they do a story on it. Then they're looking at legal exposure. They'd much rather do stories about, crazy weather and stupid pet tricks. I mean, they're not interested in going after what are really hard targets, right? The bad guys doing bad things. They'll sit at the Department of Justice and they're like stenographers, right? They take notes on what they're told. But as far as actually going out, finding people, doing interviews, peeling back the layers, they have no interest in it, none.
The question also is then what kind of impact these kind of structures have on democracy if you don't have investigative journalism anymore. The mainstream media is owned by the same capitalist structures that are involved in a lot of things. So the mainstream media is silenced, you don't have journalists, and then you come up against activity that is so harmful to the citizens of the United States. You guys, after all, have the greatest constitution probably in the modern history pertaining to the Bill of Rights and the rights of a citizen to protest, to free speech. Many of these elements you do not find in the autocratic systems in the Middle East today, for example, where people are completely silenced. So one just wonders what will happen with democracy.
Yeah, well, the other challenge to that, tying this back in, I think, in a nice circle, is that with respect to drug trafficking, the Sinaloa cartel is not worried about the Fourth Amendment, right, which would be unlawful search and seizure, right? They're not concerned about that. They don't have policies and guidebooks that describe what their agents can and can't do. They're not answering to another branch of the cartel that's conducting prosecutions or holding trials. They do what they want to do because that's what makes them money. And so we have a beautifully designed constitution with sort of empowered either law enforcement out of the executive or judiciary who all have functions and roles, but the opposition isn't playing by the same set of rules. They don't care. It's wonderful that you need to go get a search warrant. They don't. You're not going to have, non-judicial executions. Right? We're not going to kill people just because we can. They're not concerned with that. And so the playing field isn't even level or even. And then to complicate things even further, there are public officials who are corrupt within those entities who either tip off drug traffickers or are complicit in allowing them to conduct their trade. It is a very grave threat, and we don't pay enough attention to it.
And that's the precise reason why we're so surprised on complete demonization of Trump, because so much of what's happening on that on the border, I think Arizona alone sees illicit drugs worth of 10 billion yearly flow over its borders. Yeah. Everyone's aware of the massive problem of human trafficking. I mean, the selling and buying of humans. You, I believe, also have uncovered the degree of rapes happening to the women who are crossing here. We have seen, I think, something like 266,000 arrests of people with criminal records. There's like 20,000 children coming into the United States, I do believe, monthly. And considering then the degree of misuse of children that we know also is a big trade here in the United States as well and internationally, it is the most strange paradox to see how the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is fighting for her life to uphold this illegal activity?
It is, I'd like to say it's inexplicable, but unfortunately it is quite explainable. And that is, there's an effort, I think, and this again may sound terribly cynical, but there's an effort on the part of some persons to bring in as many persons as possible into the country and have them regularized in some way, meaning, what they always refer to as a path to citizenship, because they view it as their new voting base, right? This is an effort to import the next generation of, in her case, Democratic voters. And they'll say, well, we gave you a new life, you came here to America, we subsidized or we encouraged your entry, we got you enrolled to vote, and so there's this sense of sort of reverse entitlement. Well, now you owe us, right? You owe us your vote. What it ignores, though, is, first of all, just the plain humanitarian crisis of thousands of people moving around without support, without really the means to have an existence, right? There are groups that fund and support and advocate for this migration north. I've interviewed the president of Guatemala, his defense minister, his national security chief. I've been on the ground walking in Guatemala for 4 days with caravan members as they came out of Honduras, interviewed dozens of people. I'm not guessing at this, right? I've done it from on the ground, walking and talking with the people on the ground, all the way to the presidential palace. I've gotten the full spectrum of interviews in that regard. Those people are being manipulated, lied to, and used as political pawns. And then they show up at our southern border. Thankfully, President Trump has said to the Mexican government and gotten their agreement that they stay in Mexico until they file their asylum application. But that's just the humanitarian aspect of it. Forget about all the criminal aspects of it, whether it's drugs, trafficking, smuggling. Anyone who says that there's no crisis is either terribly, terribly misinformed or they're lying. Those are the only two choices available.
It really is also a question, I would argue, of which kind of system you would like to pursue in America. Because if you want to weaken the national borders of the United States, if you want to weaken law enforcement, if you want to weaken citizen rights, it's important to have an open society, which, by the way, is George Soros' a word for it. And that is very important in order to succeed, having this kind of globalist a system that really represents the new world order as the nation state. Respect for sovereignty, national sovereignty, represents the old world order, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, another facet of this that we haven't even touched on has to do with the terrorism threat on the southern border, which some people like to make fun of and say, oh, it's ridiculous, it isn't true. So not every terrorist arrives at the border with his ID card saying, hi, I'm a terrorist, right? This is a clandestine activity. And I have substantial experience in the world of clandestine activity. So I'll give you a very specific example of how this is done. So persons, let's say militant Islamists, and you can pick whatever group or whatever region this militant Islamist is from, but he has ill intentions towards the United States. And he arrives perhaps via Cuba, via Guyana, via Venezuela. There's all sorts of ways to get to the Mexican port of Tampico, right? So he arrives in Tampico, and for $1,500, he can get a full slate of ID, legitimate Mexican ID, not a stolen, document so that you can buy through corrupt Mexican officials all the right papers with the right raised seal, stamp, and signatures, and the right documentation, everything, driver's license, birth certificate, voter identification card, which the Mexicans have, with a photo and a thumbprint for their voter ID cards. You get the full slate of documentation. You're then moved inland. I have from very reliable sources, there's a series of up to 7 different camps that are established within Mexico, where you get clothing, language, culture, all this sort of training to acclimatize, to adapt. And it's the way in which the shorthand for this is Mohammed becomes Manuel. And Once the documentation is provided, they go to another site within Mexico where they get the clothing, the language, the culture, the food, I mean, the full cultural immersion. Then they're moved north, and they cross into the United States. And it's like raindrops in an ocean wave, right? There's this massive humanity that approaches the border in all different places, in different ways. Pick the one out. Which one is? And to turn a blind eye to that and say, well, we haven't seen a news report on it, so therefore it doesn't exist, I mean, is either naive or sort of willfully blind and stupid. What I've described to you is a very real scenario, without giving specific names and locations. But trust me, it's a very real threat to the United States.
And another element as well is the fact that those illegal aliens that come into the United States, they push the wages down in America too, which is
Absolutely.
one of the other reasons why I question the Democratic thrust against President Trump, as we used to feel that the Democratic Party maybe was the workers' party. It looked after the legal workforce in the United States. As of today, they're fighting for the illegal aliens, knowing very well Pelosi knows exactly what's going to happen.
So if you're in business, one of the things you can always control are your labor costs. And so you kind of squeeze the balloon where you can to maximize. And of course, a business, whether it's a small business owner or a big business executive, their obligation is to improve the value of the company. There's nothing wrong with that ethically. Where they run into trouble, though, is where they start hiring persons who are not lawfully present and not eligible to be employed. And so the business owner, let's say it's a small business owner, does he hire a guy to do construction work at $15 or $20 an hour, an American? Or does he hire an illegal for $7 an hour? What are his business competition doing? If you believe in the large-scale importation of a semi-literate or illiterate workforce, then what you're saying is you don't think the poor are poor enough. I mean, this is economics 101. You get more of what you subsidize. And when you bring more people in for lower wages, it drives down wages across the board. And you put the businessman in a position of almost forcing him to break the law, to hire someone unlawfully present at half the rate he would pay an American. And then he's also a tax cheat. He's not paying payroll taxes. He's not providing health care. He's not doing Social Security payment. I mean, all these other sort of what we think of as the fabric, the network of our sort of social support system, none of that's paid for. And then there's also unscrupulous businessmen who have a guy work for them for a week, and then the guy's expecting an envelope at the end of the week with cash in it, and he's told, drop dead, get out of here. If you complain, I'll call the cops. I'll let them know you're illegal. So there's a very brutal abuse, of people in those circumstances. And so if you want more of that, then, sign up for Nancy Pelosi, because that's what she offers, that's what she delivers. It's very dishonest, and it really is it's a crazy economic model that makes no sense. It further exploits human beings, the humanitarian portion of this, and it erodes the tax base so that regular, ordinary Americans who are busy leading their lives, even they're disserved by this.
And on that note, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Chris Farrell, from Judicial Watch, director there, for joining us here at the Herland Report, discussing the drug trade and the illegal aliens and the problem you have at your southern border, as well as President Trump.
Thanks very much.